You're the last. You're the last to know these things. Let's see. Boom. We're now live. All right. Hold on. I have to hit record. I want you to know we have successfully recorded all of these so far. And that's good.
Yes. And we are recording now and we are live. So welcome everybody to our latest live session for TheoCon, Theology in a Time of Crisis. As usual, we are delighted to be having you join us here in Edinburgh by virtual means. Of course, we've got Trip Fuller here and myself. We are in Edinburgh, Scotland. And tonight, as you will all know, we are bringing you a special session on practical theology. So this is our practical theology evening. And I am absolutely delighted to introduce our speakers. As usual, it's kind of the same sort of lineup as we've had for the other sessions. After some brief introductions and summaries of their talks, we're going to have Trip give a few minutes of brief highlights and things that have been impressing him from our talks from Leah and Andy. And then we'll turn things over for a response from our guest respondent, Milliken Peterson. And after that, we'll have some more responses, and then we will open things up and all the fun will begin. So do feel free to be sending in your questions or your comments, things you'd like us to touch on in the discussion time. And it'll be great. It'll be fun. So I am absolutely delighted to introduce our speakers this evening. If you have not had a chance to watch Leah's and Andy's talks, stay tuned. It's still going to be a good time. And as soon as we're done here, go watch their talks because they're amazing and it's worth it. So first up, we have the Reverend Dr. Leah Robinson, who is the Associate Professor of Religion at Pfeiffer University in Charlotte, North Carolina. She previously served as a lecturer in practical and pastoral theology at the University of Edinburgh. I can attest that she did wonderful things here. And university teacher in peace building and practical theology at the University of Glasgow. Her research interests include the history of Ireland and Scotland, practical theology in all its many forms, and finally, religion, violence, and peace building, broadly speaking. Her favorite courses to teach are on practical, feminist, Black, and queer theologies. She writes on subjects that range from feminist trauma theologies to sectarianism in Scottish sports. Not that there's any of that here. Her newest contracted book is entitled Bad Theology, Oppression in the Name of God. It'll be published in 2022 with SCM Press and is about the way that practical theology has been used to justify some of the world's worst atrocities. When she is not uplifting her soul with all this jolly academic content, and she finally takes that itchy academic hat off, you'll probably find her on some back porch in the South drinking red wine, petting her 2 cats, and talking about Georgia football, or naming top 10 favorite musical artists of all time, or etc. She's a lot of fun. Next up, we have Andrew Root, Dr. Andrew Root, who is the Carrie Olson Balson or Baleson? I think it's Balson. We'll go with Balson tonight. Balson, Professor of Youth and Family Ministry at Luther Seminary. He's most recently the author of The Pastor in a Secular Age, Ministry to People Who No Longer Need God, published in 2019. As well as a book called Exploding Stars, Dead Dinosaurs and Zombies, Youth Ministry in the Age of Science, published in 2018. I can attest that this is a fabulous book for anybody looking for good resources for youth ministry on science and religion. This is excellent. In addition, he's got some books, for example, called Faith Formation in the Secular Age and The Grace of Dogs, A Boy, a Black Lab, and Father's Search for the Canine Soul. He's got many other things that he's written, but you can go ahead and Google him if you want more information about his published works. He's done a lot with the intersection of ministry and divine action theology, and has been doing just a lot of really groundbreaking work in the intersection of science and youth ministry more broadly. Andy has worked in congregations, parachurch ministries, and social service programs. He lives in St. Paul with his wife, Kara, 2 children, Owen and Maisie, and their dog. When not reading, writing, or teaching, Andy spends, in his words, far too much time watching TV and movies. And finally, not least, we have Dr. Milliken Peterson, who teaches Christian theology at Augustana University, which I've just learned how to pronounce, with particular emphases in religion and medical sciences, feminist theologies, theology and the arts, and Lutheran constructive theology. She's also an adjunct professor in the section for ethics and humanities at the Sanford School of Medicine of the University of South Dakota. She has written 5 books, including Where in the World is God? Variations on a Theme, God, Creation, and All That Jazz, another fantastic title, The Music of Creation, co-authored with the Reverend Dr. Canon Arthur Peacock, and The Geography of God's Incarnation, Landscapes and Narratives of Faith, and Our Bodies, Ourselves. Our Bodies, Ourselves, co-authored with Philip Hefner and Susan Barreto. She's also authored entries in the Oxford Handbook of Religion and Science and numerous articles in Zygon, Word and World, and others. She received her doctorate in theology from the Lutheran School of Theology at Chicago and was awarded Our Savior's Lutheran Church Chair in Religion in 2012 to 2014, and in 2012 to 2014 was one of the 2 recipients of the Carol Bland Cultivating Faculty Excellence Endowment in 2010 and 2011. We have a very accomplished bunch of people with us tonight, as you can tell. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to them. I've been talking long enough. And so we're going to start with Leah, who will give us a brief summary of her talk. Thank you, Leah.
Thank you, Sarah. I do want to do the obligatory thanking of our hosts. Thank you, Sarah and Trepp, who've been incredibly organized and put a lot of effort into this. So it's greatly appreciated. Really good to see you again and to meet you, Trepp. I've heard a lot about you and good things. Don't worry. Right. So a summary. So I want to start by saying that I was happy to hear that Andy was also using his time in this conference to be able to test out some of his ideas for a much bigger book project that is to come in the future. And I myself have presented a summary of what will be a far bigger work. And now I'm going to do a summary of the summary. So it's going to be very bare bones. So if you want to hear further, please do watch the paper. So my presentation that I gave was divided into several parts. So my first section gave a bit of a background as to why I was interested in looking at the way practical theology can be manipulated and used to oppressive ends in history and today. I talked about my discovery in my initial research into Northern Ireland when I was a PhD student, and related how I had seen practical theology expressed in a clear, coherent manner, but that was ultimately examples of bad practical theology that justified violence. This interested me and likewise scared me. I was a little baby theologian at this stage, and I just wanted to get my PhD and run away. I didn't want to cause controversy. I just wanted to pass. Now, as a weathered, old, and gray theologian, I brought this idea of bad theology off the shelf. My second and third section explained further what I meant by bad practical theology, and my fourth and fifth section offered examples of this in the current world of coronavirus. So my paper was ultimately, and is ultimately, a practical theology project that engages with other theologians who've come before me in order to set up criteria for what I've declared as oppressive, or indeed, if you want to be bold, bad theology. This practical theology foundation is vital, though, because it clarifies that instead of using my platform to create a new dogmatics, I am instead looking to use folks like Osmer and others, tried and true method of looking at theology, examining it, asking what happened, ask what should be happening, and then looking at theology again and repeating. Practical theology is based on this cyclical version of theological method, this fluid notion of theology, this idea that theology is constantly evolving, moving through context and people who present it. As a result, using practical theology as my home base means that when we look at the criteria for good and bad theology, we can talk and discuss examples and take away and add accordingly. Alongside practical theological colleagues, other friends of this project include more contemporary theologians who views older theologians in their works, and that's specifically Catherine Tanner's theories of culture and Gordon Kaufman's theological imagination. Ultimately, these authors highlight the importance of seeing theology as a human construct, and as a result, the danger of theology being seen as infallible when in fact it is deeply, deeply subjective and earthly. I further discuss my inspiration for good and bad theology through the works of the previously mentioned authors, but also specifically the work of Peter Vardy, Good and Bad Religion, and also Duncan Ferguson, who I believe I called Duncan Forrester in the paper, but corrections corner, Duncan Ferguson, exploring the spirituality of the world religions. Through both of these texts, there is a criteria that is set up that examines the way that religion has been determined to be both good and bad in history, as well as spirituality as being life-denying and life-affirming. I use this criteria as inspiration for what I deem as bad practical theology. I have a list of what I determine to be bad practical theology, which we can go into, I'm sure we will, and that is also to be found on the video. So finally, I use this criteria to analyze several case studies within the context of the coronavirus. I used an article from the Reverend Lamar in Washington, D.C., who claimed bad theology was killing his parishioners. I also used examples from Jim Bakker and his miracle silver solution, as well as ministers in the USA and South Korea who have claimed miraculous healing through their churches and sacred objects, in the case of South Korea, resulting in thousands of deaths. In my conclusion, I speculated about why one would want to go about a project like this. I used the coronavirus as a perfect example of why. In times such as these, it is the purpose of the practical theologian to call out what is and what should be. While that inevitably will be biased, it's still our task. And while this paper will cause debate and discussion, it doesn't make it any less important in our discipline. One person's good theology is another person's bad theology. But let's talk about it before it's too late. And finally, I called Jim Bakker a bad name, which is deserved. The end.
Thanks very much, Leah. Now I will turn things over to Andy.
Yeah, thank you guys. And thanks, Leah. That was great. I'm still traumatized from having given mine. It's it's a soul. It's just a soul crushing thing to talk into your computer and get no feedback. So I'm still traumatized by it, but I'm happy to be here and be re-traumatized. So thank you guys very much for having me. My paper I think fits within practical theology because I think at the core practical theology is really a discipline around action. Sarah had mentioned reflecting on divine action, but then also reflecting on human action and how those things relate. And the trajectory of my work has been, at least in the last 3 or 4 years, looking a lot at Charles Taylor's work and how he looks at human action particularly. And Taylor had led me into a new kind of intellectual crush, this German social theorist named Hartmann Rosa. And so my paper really revolves around the thought of Rosa, who wrote his own dissertation on Taylor and has had a few projects that have been pretty significant in Germany particularly, and I think are really relevant for us. One is a whole project called Social Acceleration that really looks at trying to define modernity as the continuing speeding up of our lives in multiple different ways. And then he's had this new project called Resonance, which I think is also quite interesting. But what resonated for me in his work in relation to our time is how everything slowed down after our shutdowns, that everything kind of came to a halt. And following Rosa and Taylor, I do want to kind of explore how human action is embedded in certain senses of the good life and what it means to live the good life, that people either implicitly or explicitly have some kind of sense of what is good and are having strong evaluations about that. And really trying to explore maybe the existential crisis of this moment when everything stops. And Rosa's whole point is in an accelerated modernity, and how we end up defining the good life is that we really don't have much content for the good life in the present, in the right now. But we have a lot of it is projected into the future. So it becomes about harvesting resources, and particularly when we think about our children, helping our children have all sorts of resources and activities that will help them live whatever dream they want to live in the future. And so I think it's possible, maybe we'll have to do some empirical research on this, but my sense through kind of Rose's lens is I think that this pandemic, with everything stopping and all the incredibly sad graduations that are happening online, I just saw one yesterday of some Florida kids doing their graduation on jet skis, like coming up to a boat. So all the weird things that have been going on that way, it's just really sad. And it's because there's been this movement towards getting your kids and preparing your kids for some future dream that they can live. And in some ways that's been halted, and our lives have been really slowed down. And I think it maybe has some existential kind of overtones to that. So I'll just conclude by saying, I mean, Rose has a quote that I use in my piece that I think is really interesting, where he says that the modern condition is that we're like painters who keep buying more paints and setting the easel and organizing where the light comes into the window. But late modern people rarely ever paint, that we rarely ever have any kind of content for what the good life is now. And I think this has pretty strong ramifications for congregational life, and that congregations get pulled into that too, and think that what makes a good congregation is harvesting resources for some future that stands in opposition to decline. Maybe we need to take this crisis and think about what that means in relation to the good life and what it means for congregational life as well. So I will stop there.
All right. So before we turn things over to Anne, there are a few things after both of you sitting here marking off things you mentioned that I thought of bringing to the fore, but a few things that I think would be helpful to frame a larger conversation is one, picking up with what Andy was talking about, is that the good life has been turned into a very deadly promissory note. That when the good life is not something that has material reality in the present, in the way you live with your community, the way you are engaged in life in the world, and it becomes something you're always preparing to eventually get to, then the good life is actually the bad life. It's like The Bad Place, right? Like if in the TV show, that you're just sitting there and you're sitting there, and then and we're sitting here now in lockdown, and this is kind of what I was going through my mind in listening to Andy's talk, that all of a sudden there are the people that fit in the kind of, middle classy elite who are working real hard, trying to do all the things, to jump through all the hoops. You can finally get to a place where you can have something that you call stable. And then obviously at that point, you'll have a better relationship to your friends, family, and finitude. And then you're sitting there pausing on day 10 of the lockdown, and you kind of are thinking, are we in the bad place? And you don't know if you want to mention it yet, but then your 12-year-old son, at least mine did, said, hey, Dad, do you want to binge watch The Good Life at night? And then I'm sitting there watching it, and I got Andy's message, his video had uploaded into our Dropbox, and I started watching it, and I got halfway through, and I'm done with this shit. This is really messing with my mind. And I say all that because, like, even when I talk to people I love and care in the middle of lockdown, I don't think we're honest about just how accurate the description he gives is real. That we're all sitting there going like, well, maybe if things get better, all the energy I've invested to eventually get to a point I don't begrudge large amounts of the time I spend with people I care about investing in the future will finally pay off. Won't they, Andy? Please tell me it will. Dear Lord Jesus, come quickly. Right? Like, and I think that experience is so palpable. It was just nice that you used footnotes so it didn't sound like a confessional. But the good life, if it functions as a very deadly promissory note, as a dream deferred, is a real problem. And it is a bad theology that ultimately kills, which is exactly what Leah was talking about. And one of the things that connection, I just want to hear you both talk about, because if you look at the test for a practical theologian testing theology, right? Like, yes, if you think white evangelicalism in America's connection to nationalism, economism, white supremacy, and all that kind of stuff is going to fail, yeah, that's probably going to fail. But what about just like mainline Protestant Lutheranism in Minnesota, right? I think that's like what Andy's point is. Like, there's a whole lot of religions that are setting you up if you realize practically the material relationship we have with the good life. And so Leah gives, this is my rendition of it, but the question of You should have the test of flourishing to all theology. You should have a test of the other and the neighbor. Does the other and the neighbor think your theology is helpful, or does it make them want to gag and stab their face, right? Or maybe put a mask on your face. The test of critical and self-reflection. Like when you talk about God, are you able to be self-reflective and critical? The test of justice, the test of pluralism. Like she starts to ask these like seemingly really obvious questions if you want to do God and not be horrible at the same time. And yet most of the questions you internalize in a religious community are about the self-preservation of that community. And it's that element that connects with what Andy talks about as the 3 A's of, see, I stopped looking at my notes, of availability, accessibility, and attainability. That in this promissory note, future-oriented, but open, or future-oriented relationship to the world, which is ultimately not fulfilling, then you start to reduce your engagement to things that are available, accessible, and attainable for getting towards that future. And what does that look like in a church? A mega church. And what does that look like in a church that's not a mega church? Feeling like you're doing a bad job, right? And as someone who worked at the largest UCC church in Los Angeles, and then when I stopped working there for 8 years, joined the smallest, like there are real perks of worshiping in a room with 70 people and your children hug 3 different generations they're not related to. And if the whole time you wish you were at the church, the other one, that's a problem, right? But it's hard to detox once you've internalized the logic that we've gotten to. And I would like, one question I have is, where did that logic come from? Is it what part of it is cultural? What part of it is kind of like neoliberal economic order? What part of it is the millennials and younger inheriting the American dream and it becoming less and less plausible for more people? What part of it is just the group of people who came of age post 9/11? So the idea of an institution and a meta narrative not being full of it is just problematic. Like I'm interested in some more diagnoses there. And the last 2 things that came up in both of your talks I wanted to emphasize is you both hint at the way pluralism in our post-religious context changes what faith means, right? We don't share a meta-narrative, we don't share a sacred canopy and all these type of things. But if you're using Charles Taylor's language, but if you're cross-pressured in an immanent frame, then what faith means is different. And some of the stories Leah told and thinking of the examples Charles Taylor gave, I wonder if we need practical theologians to tell us what faith in a post-religious age looks like. Because theologians are in a conversation with dead people who, like Taylor puts the beginning of secular age, who if you ask them, does God exist? For most of them, they were like, you asked that question? Right? But now that question's vapid for people. And so I wonder in a context where religion isn't assumed and it's optional, if then the nature of faith changes and our nostalgia for an old version ends up leading to the examples of bad theology that were given and the type of promissory note for the good life. Because underneath what both of you said, the good news element is, I heard is the goodness of God and the depth of life possible has already been given to you and it's in front of you. And if you just keep pushing the plates away from all the main course and hope that you eventually get to dessert, you're going to miss it. And it's that type of deferral from the very materiality that's in front of you that's problematic. And then the fun question is, if you could both zap any specific theological idea from the popular lexicon, and as practical theologians, you realize, wow, that's good. Which one would it be? You just like zip, zip. And that idea like disappears and it disappears from all the hymnals and worship songs. No one uses it to make people cry at a youth retreat on the last night when they're tired and on sugar. And you don't get theologically canceled for questioning it. Anyway, so those are the connection points between the two, and hopefully it gets everyone excited, because now you get to hear from someone I've had an ongoing second-hand relationship with, Ann Peterson, and now she's here to respond. So here you go.
Great. Thank you, Trip. First of all, again, thanks to both of the hosts. This has been a very easy and friendly group to be a part of, and to both Leah and Andy for your talks. I was actually spiritually challenged by both of them, so I appreciate that. I want to begin my remarks with an article I actually just came on yesterday by Catherine Keller called Pandemic and Pandemonium. And it's just a brief quote. She says, "And of course, the multiplicity of these interlinked issues, itself issues from a web of even deeper intersections. Each human linked to each other human, to each other joined inseparably in an echo choreography of our vivid differences." And I love that language of choreography of vivid differences. And I'm hoping that will get at what I think is common in your papers and some comments and questions I have. First, I'll just mention what I think were connections that I felt you both had, and reflect on those briefly. The first is, of course, how do we talk and live into the good life in the midst of crises and in the midst of the moment? And what difference does our theology make? The second one I took from Leah and from Andy, which is naming, the importance of naming out loud, or what a Lutheran would call calling a thing what it is. It reminded me of Luther's Heidelberg Disputation and how important it is to name what's going on. And Leah, I really appreciated that in your paper, and the courage to do so, because if you don't name it, you can't reflect on it. And that naming occurs in the present moment. I think, Andy, you're right. If we don't name things, we keep putting off the trouble in the present and hold out for the future. Both of you emphasize temporality. Embodiment came through loud and clear, and to a certain degree, place. I would like us to talk even more about how place intersects with temporality and with embodiment. And I'll mention more about that later, but I've learned a lot of corrections about place living out here on the plains, and learning from Native American scholars like Tinker, and then also, oddly enough, from early Celtic theology, works by Philip Sheldrake, where place and time are linked by concepts of journey and staying put, dwelling. So we'll get back to that. Both of you, I think, also addressed the deep, deep sense of grief, fear, and what I would call loss. And that this loss is real for everybody. It manifests itself in different ways. A physician I work with, Dr. Jerome Freeman, has called this experience medically by the term chronic sorrow, which I love. He talks about it being different than depression, but it leads one into this kind of chronic state of mourning everything that's lost. And I think practical theology needs to take how that loss is coupled with fear in our culture and address that. The other thing is I just linked process, practice, presence, place, and the word pan, God in all things. Both of you allude to that, and I want to talk about how theology in a crisis reflects on all of us. That's why I like that quote from Keller, is because it's not just a human crisis. And the reasons for that I'll explain more in a minute. So finally, I want to talk about theology as narrative, which I heard in both of yours. The importance of story, but not in its sort of linear, sequential, once upon a time, but in the messiness of the plot lines intertwined. One person who I think gives sort of a popular theology, and And Lee, I'm guessing you've read Kate Bullock's book, Everything Happens for a Reason, and all the other lies I come to hate or whatever. But that's a great example, I think, of how at least in the context I work a lot, which is medical scenarios, that narrative, that when the physician takes the patient's story, of course, it's an anamnesis, the same calling to remembrance that we do in the Eucharist as Christians. So it's an importance to me too about how narrative works and the telling of our stories, which is part of what you did so wonderfully in Good and Bad Theology. So the first way I'm going to respond is a little constructive response to the two of you, and I'm using Donna Haraway as a resource. You may know Donna Haraway, feminist, philosopher of science, biologist, whose work has influenced a lot of people. I'm sure Tripp knows her work, and I know Catherine Keller has used a lot of it. First of all, she talks about how in these times, she uses in one of her most recent books, it's called Staying with the Trouble. And I really like that. I think it works well with Andy's notion and both with how to name theology. If we don't live in the present moment, we can't stay with people's pain. And that's been part of, I think it's no surprise that we're in multiple crises at this point around race and gender and class and illness. And part of that is the ability to stay with the trouble. The analogy I use is as a musician and using a lot of Jeremy Begbie's work, especially, and I hear this in congregations, when you use really dissonant music, the complaint is, well, that sounds awful. Let's not use that. I remember when the Lutheran hymnal, the green one, came out, and there was this harmonic interpretation of a hymn by Vincent Persichetti, and all the congregations wanted it out. But my comment was, we're not used to listening and sticking with the dissonance and how important that is. So it's a listening strategy, if you will. Another piece is how to practice staying with the trouble, but also in a way that maximizes both the grief of it and the joy of it. And one person whose work has been foundational for me in this is Csikszentmihalyi's work Flow. You may or may not know that, but it's a marvelous example of how to live in to the depth of the present moment. And what he means by that is not sort of sitting by meditating on your plant in your window, but being actively and fully participant in the work you do, whether you're the mail carrier, working, teaching, whatever that work is, or whatever your pastimes are. The danger is, and I think Andy caught this, boredom, right, is the opposite of flow. And because we postpone the future, we live without the present. And then a little treatise that Arthur Peacock pointed me to years ago that I reread occasionally, even though there's some doubt he actually wrote it. The name of the author is Jean-Pierre de Caussade. The title of the book is called The Sacrament of the Present Moment. And it was written as a treatise to the nuns that he mentored about what it's like to live in the moment. And one of the analogies he used again was practicing. In this case, the piano or music. But I think of the athletes I know, the student athletes who have taught me again about how practicing what they do helps them for the choreography of the future, but they have to be very fully present in the moment. And then again from Haraway, another language that she uses that I've sort of adopted is that we become a modest witness. I like that language because it means you stay with the present trouble, but the first act of that, especially for the people you addressed, Andy, the sort of middle to upper middle class, and here I would put even white folks like myself, is learning to listen. The Benedictine rule always comes to my mind there about how important that is. And then the third from her is the language of choreography. Donna Haraway has written a great couple of great books. The last one, When Species Meet. For those of you who don't know her work, she's an avid dog person, an agility trainer, and Sarah probably doesn't know this about me, but I'm all things canine. We did the typical COVID thing, in part, sadly, had to put our 12-year-old standard poodle down, and now we have a new puppy. And there's a choreography that develops when you are companion species. And it teaches me to respect his dogness and not treat him like a fur child. And I think of that language of agility training where you practice over and over and over. It's a little bit, and Tripp has heard this image from me before, but like jazz improv, right? You have to practice all the time in order to be free enough to relate to the other. So I love her language about that. So that's my use of Haraway, and I'll conclude with just a couple comments about embodiment. What does it mean to talk about embodiment? I would say as entanglement. Or as interlocking, you pull one thread and everything begins to unravel and you look at where the knots are. Embodiment, so what does it mean to talk about, this is part of the work I did on Hefner, but I think it runs through both of your talks. How do we talk about humans as selves, but also bodies? It reminds me of the quote that my friend Paul Sponheim used to use. I think it's in Modes of Thought by Whitehead. You don't walk into a room and say, hi, I'm Tripp and I brought my body with me, right? You are, in a certain sense, your body. And I use that language of body self. I don't know what else to use. I think it's awkward how we talk about embodiedness. And particularly, I love the work of David Chalmers and Andy Clark on extended mind or embodied mind. I first heard this at an ISSR conference and was really blown away by it. The notion, right, that our typical notion is that the mind is confined to the brain, but this talks about its extension into the environment, whether that's your cell phone or whether it's the piece of paper you use to take notes, that our mind is, in a sense, extended into the environment, which has huge implications, I think, for something like this pandemic. An example of that might be the link, and this is some of my own interest, but how this pandemic will influence upcoming generations. So really looking at the field that my colleague Jennifer Goebbels is working in, which is epigenetics and reproduction, looking at the effects of how this trauma and even bad theology will have on future generations. And if you know the work in epigenetics, you know how important that extended field is for the turning off and on and expression of genes, and work being done on historical trauma, for example. And I think trauma will affect people differently depending on where they're situated. So I think bringing up those connections is really important. The last piece I'll leave you with is kind of my own question, which is, what role does beauty, the arts, imagination have in addressing both of your pieces? And I leave you with a brief quote by Alfred North Whitehead that was in The Aims of Education, his little book. It goes like this: imagination is a contagious disease. It cannot be measured by the yard or weighed by the pound and then delivered to the students by members of the faculty. It can only be communicated by a faculty whose members themselves wear their learning with imagination. So I loved his metaphor that imagination is a contagious disease, because we have two contagions going on here. And I believe sometimes what we lack is the imagination to deal with it.
Thank you so much, Anne. We now have some time for our speakers to respond. So I will first turn things over to Leah.
Yes, thanks very much. I've got much writing and points here from all that you've said. And actually, I grabbed this down from the shelf while you were talking about imagination, which, it's sort of awkward just to read it in front of you. So I won't. But really, really interesting observations and questions. When you're talking about the idea of embodiment and entanglement, one of the things that keeps coming into my mind when I'm talking about practical theology is that when I was taught practical theology, it was theology that has legs. That was what people would say. Now there's problems with that, right? In terms of, many problems with that as we go along. But one thing that I kept thinking about in light of all of the stuff that's been going on around George Floyd is this idea of what if practical theology is theology that has breath? And the connection between this idea of breath and wearing masks and coming into contact with one another, and that sort of imagery is this idea of the breath being the thing that is able to create life and is life-giving, but is also the thing that is also creating death in this pandemic. And then connecting it again to this I can't breathe, which to me is it's a different topic, but it's just been in my mind so much. So this idea that as long as we have breath, we are capable of speaking truth and writing truth, and writing about God. And again, you can talk about stuff with the Holy Spirit, but I just think it's an interesting thing because I always heard this embodied language. And then I would talk to people who wrote stuff on disability and they would say, well, this is actually quite problematic, some of that language. And so I like the idea of breath. So that's one of the things that came out. I'm going to let Annie talk as well, but that was one of the things that came along is this idea of practical theology has always had this really unfortunate thing where we feel like we have to identify ourselves in every context we're in. You don't hear systematic people being like, well, my first 10 minutes will be about what systematics are, and what I am. So it's like one of these things, but I like that idea of the connection between practical theology and breathed theology that's coming from a human.
Yeah, Andy, go for it.
Okay. Yeah, thanks, Anne. I appreciate the comments. And the Paul Sponheim reference was nice because Paul used to have an office right across the hallway before he retired for me. So it's great to think about Paul. But a lot of connections, I think, that I'm hoping to build off the work that I'm doing with my paper that connect to a lot of things that you said. I mean, one of the things that I thought about, particularly as it related to even some of Tripp's comments, is how really we can think about maybe two different forms of action. And one of the people that Rose is really drawing off is the Frankfurt School thinker Erich Fromm in his little book, To Have or to Be. And so Fromm does this thing where he talks about the having mode of action or the being mode of action. And one of the most fascinating pieces, he says, when you get caught in the having mode of action, then what action is the expenditure of energy. And the ramifications of that good action then is expending energy. And that will mean that busyness will become a high good in a culture and a society, which seems to really fit who we are. And I think is where kind of Rosa is going. And as I relate this to kind of congregational life, I think part of our problem that is really killing our congregations is that we've taken in this form of action. And so almost every pastor and every congregation is thinking, how do we have more families? How do we have more money? How do we have more people coming to our church instead of the other church down the street? And there really is a kind of sense of the having mode of action, which then just leads to busyness. And so we do tend to think that the churches that are the best, put that in air quotes, are the ones that are the busiest. They have the most programs, they have the most people in their parking lot, that the busier you are, the better you're doing. To talk like a 4-year-old, you're gooder than the other churches if you have more actions. But Rose's point, which I think is really connects with your understanding of flow and things like that, is he thinks that makes that kind of form of action makes alienation endemic, in that we end up as modern people alienated from just about everything. Not just kind of alienated in a Marxist sense of kind of from the means of production or something, or economically alienated, but he thinks we just become alienated from life, that life feels dull, that we don't feel like there's a live wire between us and the world, that we're just too busy to actually be in the world itself, which I think is really interesting. So he actually draws from some of the flow conversation too, and the way he defines that is thinking about resonance, where we feel like we're being spoken to again. And to me, there's a huge theological connection there. At least early Protestant theology has this deep sense of a speaking God, and that God responds in speaking. But for me to do my gloss on Charles Taylor, part of the issue of this kind of secular age we're in is that people don't feel like the world speaks to them, let alone a living God speaks to them, that they just feel too busy to even be in the world, that they're rushing to the next thing. And I think that becomes a huge challenge for pastoral ministry and pastoral theology, to think beyond that. And then waiting becomes something that becomes, I think, really fertile, important. How do we help people wait for the living God to speak, or wait to actually be together? But when action is the expenditure of energy and it is about busyness, waiting is a bitch. Like, you hate waiting. You don't want to wait. And in certain places, the no place places, like, well, we don't go to them anymore, but the waiting areas outside of a airport gate, like, we hate waiting in those places, and they become incredibly boring because we all have this kind of projection of getting to the next thing, of moving forward, that we can't really be in the now. And those places are actually constructed to feel like no places at all, because you're just supposed to wait those and bear the waiting and move on to something else, as opposed to the waiting itself being fertile. And so do we need more formation into waiting as a way to open ourselves up to the speaking of a living God in a world that's alive?
Actually, I want to jump in, and can I? Yeah. Okay. So one of the things that you said, and that was really struck me, and actually kind of challenged me quite significantly, is this idea of staying with the trouble. Like, I wrote that and just put it underlined, underlined, underlined. And it kind of ties with what you're saying, Andy, actually, is in that practical theology method that I was talking about, that circle. Whenever I use that and I'm talking about something as being bad practical theology, I tend to want to find it and then to look at it and identify it and then move on, like to go on the other side of the circle. I actually don't want to sit with it, because if you sit with it and you try to see all the angles of it and where these conclusions came from and why this person said this or why they believe this, like, I don't want to sit with the KKK and figure out where they came up with this doctrine. I don't want to do that. I want to name it as bad, and I want to move on, and I want to go to a circle that we can reflect on that as being bad. And it's interesting because I do think there's space there to wait and to sit with it. You don't have to like it or agree with it, but to stay with the trouble for just a moment, as opposed to just moving because you're hesitant or you're just wanting to get through it, right? So I like that, and I think that's really the spirit of reflection, and that maybe why reflection is so hard, because we have to sit with stuff that we don't always like. And so I like that idea of staying with the trouble and sticking with the dissonance, you said as well, and just not rushing past something just because we don't like it or we're bored with it or we think it's really screwed up. I'm trying to limit my language.
Well, so like with that, one of the stories you told, Leah, in your larger talk was, I guess, getting put in, I don't know, theological, in front of the theological inquisitor in your research in Northern Ireland, and that experience, just like a number of the other ones you gave, reminded me of this time, in the like sitting with the trouble. When I had a friend, or they were a congregant at a church that had a wine cellar, which I had never been with people that had those until I worked at a church in Palos Verdes Estates, where that's a normal activity. And the dates on it are like before I was born, right? And this was the Trip's going to drink a wine and he'll finally choose wine over craft beer day. And so they open up the wine bottle and it smells horrible. And he goes, "No, you just have to let it breathe." And like when he said that, I was like, okay, I'm going to email myself this because I feel like I'm going to use this as a sermon illustration later. Right. And it smelled horrible. And then like 20 minutes later, it kind of calms down. He pours it into this like decanter thing. And then it's like drinking like wine chocolate, and it's wonderful. Right. And like when you were telling that story of someone from the Troubles, I remember Pete Rollins, when we lived together for a while, like he was the extra member of our family, talking about sitting with people when they're working through the process, where like after they get through the signaling of which side they're on, and after they get through the stories of kind of like identity labeling, then they tell you where they've really been hurt. And it's the pain and the violence that was done to their family and friends that means they have an allegiance to, right, all those theological reasons that you talked about someone having. And like if you let it breathe, like sometimes if you just look at what's on the front or just on the page, you're rolling your eyes and going, do I get a chance to grade this? Because it won't be hard. But if you like let it breathe long enough, the humanity and stuff comes to the front. And I think this moment of crisis is one of those where, as ministers, just hearing from ones that listen to the podcast, there's been a lot of needing to let it breathe, because you found just how much papered over pain and trauma exists in so many people. And if we get over the stench and pour it out, there's also really beautiful things in so many people that don't get valued and treasured, because we're ready to, get rid of somebody for just what comes out of their mouth in the first 5 minutes of any conversation.
I wonder if both Lee and Andy, any of you could respond to this, is how congregational life actually helps people stay with the trouble. There's an old story Annie Dillard had about going to church and hearing the same pleas week after week after week, and finally just wanting to be the pastor and run up to the altar and lament, how come you aren't listening to us? What's your problem? I got it. And I think, I think churches are somewhat comfortable with staying with the trouble, but not very. And Andy, in particular, your example of small congregations hit painfully around here. Sioux Falls is home to a couple of the largest in the ELCA, but South Dakota has many small, barely thriving parishes on the prairie. And wondering how, from both of you, you understand parish life to help people stay with the trouble.
I'll go. It's interesting. I have a tumultuous relationship with the church because I grew up Southern Baptist. So we'll just leave it there. But I am an ordained minister. So I think it's interesting, and we're talking about narrative, and that's how I like to work as well. And so I have a very good friend, and she is from Georgia as well. And she visits her family on the 4th of July that weekend. And so she says this last 4th of July, or maybe, no, it was the previous one because of what's going on. She had gone to a service at a Southern Baptist church with her family. And the pastor usually gave a very hellfire brimstone sermon, and usually something about patriotism. So this time, he did that, but he also talked about the fact that he had consulted a couple of African-American ministers in the area, and he was really highlighting how important he felt that was. Now, afterwards, I was talking to my friend about this, and she was like, he was so negative the whole time, and then he had this moment where he said, but I've talked to these to people, and here's what I've learned. And you had this moment of self-reflection where he actually came forth and said, I've learned a lot. Now we could say in that's really good. That's movement, right? But then she also said, but then my mother can't be a deacon in that church, right? My mother can't be a minister in that church. If I was to go up and want to say something in front of the church, I couldn't do that sort of thing. So it's one of these things where I think with sticking with, if we're talking about staying with the trouble, I think congregations are good at it within their own framework of theological acceptance, if that makes sense. So they may branch out a bit, but he's not going to say, I went and met with 2 women ministers in the area, right? So yes and no, I guess. Yes, as long as it doesn't stretch that theological bubble too far. So that's my thoughts on it.
Yeah, I would only add that I guess is biographical in the sense of saying I just have been in the last 5 years so much less interested in disciplinary conversations about practical theology and thinking more about kind of pastors on the ground and congregations on the ground than at kind of thinking about how we find barriers within academic fields to justify different fields. But I think that the pastoral imagination is huge. And I think if the pastor feels like she is a good pastor, if how she answers that will determine if the congregation can wait or if it can't. Because if he or she feels like their job is to build this church, it is to accrue, it's to be relevant, then waiting is a blockage to the kind of action of having. But if you have a different form of action and you're in the being form, then those moments become real possibilities to lean into for God to move and for God to arrive in those very moments. So yeah, I mean, it goes back to Tripp's thing about being a mega church. And, I like mega churches. Some of my best friends are mega churches. But there's also a problem of what it does to, I think, every pastor, say in a synod or in a conference or something, what it does to all the rest of the pastor's imagination, where you're thinking, that's what I'm supposed to get to. The bishop will really like me if we can grow at 10, 15, 20%. And this is one of the really, I think, fascinating things that we'll find here post-pandemic is the kind of logic of neoliberalism just comes in to congregational life as well. And so this is another thing, not to quote Rosa too much, but he talks about dynamic stabilization. And he says a way modern institutions stabilize themselves is through growth. Growth is what stabilizes you. So your school or your little company or your even family economy is doing well if you have a little bit more next year than you had this year. So you need to be seeing 10, 15% growth, or else you are a dying whatever you are. And I've seen so many bishops that's fallen into their imaginations as they've seen decline within their synods, that okay, this church has to be growing, or we're not going to throw good money at bad money. So if this congregation isn't seeing 5 to 10% growth, then we really need to do an intervention on that church, and maybe we need to close that church. That's a very different kind of logic. And if you feel that as a pastor, how could you ever wait? I mean, you got to move, or your bishop's going to come and close you down, or at the very least, you're going to look at your friends across Facebook and feel like, man, I'm a terrible pastor. And so I think there's just a different logic that plays within that.
Just a follow-on question about sitting with the trouble. Both of you, Andy and Leah, you play with the idea of a good life for Andy and human flourishing as sort of a criteria for good theology for Leah. And one of the like and Leah, you were just hinting at this. One of the challenges that come up when we're talking about sitting with the trouble is that it's very difficult to do when that trouble has to do with someone who disagrees with how we define human flourishing or the good life, right? And it's and I think there's a very good chance that so many people, including myself, will listen to both of your talks and say, yeah, of course, I agree. Like, of course, yeah, human flourishing, good goal. Yes, good life, and not defined by not defined by our constant forward-looking metrics of success, and one of the things I'm constantly confronted with every time I step outside of academia is that Christians on the ground have very different understandings of what human flourishing might look like. For many people, drinking the silver potion might be exactly what they think human flourishing looks like. Or bribing their kids' way into a great college might seem to be exactly the thing that is needed to ensure that their child has a good life, and they might have some internal logic that makes that work for them. So I'm curious about how the three of you handle this tension of this reality that good theology or what a definition of a good life is seems pretty obvious to many of us, but when we actually go out into the streets, into the congregations, we quickly run up against views that most of us would say are blatantly, obviously bad theology or the exact opposite of the good life. But finding a way to sit with that difference and that sort of, and oftentimes a very aggressive difference, a very sort of confrontational difference, it doesn't feel productive. Anyone who's ever had a conversation with anyone on social media knows how non-productive sort of coming to an understanding of what human flourishing means or a good life means, especially in a time of crisis, will recognize that it's not comfortable, and it doesn't often feel like progress is being made in any sort of like discernible way. So I'm wondering if you could speak a bit to that. So sort of, I'll let you take that where you want.
Yeah, and I think that's a great question. I mean, it's one of the reasons why I have such a long buildup in the beginning of my paper about theology being a human construction, because I think whether you're in academics, we'll start there, and then we'll go to the people on the ground. It's kind of, there's similar ways of speaking about theology in both. And you would go to a research seminar at any university, choose your poison, and people who are doing theology will present an idea, and then you're going to get 75 hands that are raised that are going to say, probably not a real question, but they're going to tell you about the theology they would have written that is in contradiction to your theology. And so it goes. And this is kind of how it's been, is you write something and then someone will write something else that they don't like about it. And that's academia. You move that to Facebook or a congregation. You know, how many times did I preach a sermon where you have that classic line, well, pastor, that was a good sermon, but, and you're just like, oh, here we go, you know? And so in some ways it's quite similar between the two worlds, because you have this area that's unlike a lot of academic areas and life areas where people feel like they have to have it exactly right. And the problem with having it exactly right is that no one does. And if they do, then it's a lot different from everybody else's exactly right. So I think the big thing about talking about good and bad theology, and why I lead up with, Gordon Kaufman, for example, and Kathy Tanner, is this idea that we have to see that what we're doing doesn't have one answer. And once we acknowledge that, and we acknowledge that we have created a system within ourselves of what we believe and think, then we can sit with other people and say, okay, so you think this totally opposite thing, but luckily we don't have to battle it out, because it's okay that you think that. Now, when it starts to become harmful, that in the world, we can talk about that. And that's where the naming of bad theology is important. But that doesn't mean that you can't sit with people. I mean, I grew up in North Georgia. Trust me, I have relatives, I have friends. I've had to sit, with them through many hard theological conversations. I am not going to convince them of anything, and they're not going to convince me. But I think it's a real spiritual gift, the action of sitting with people and being able to hear that perspective, because you're never going to convince people. I mean, evangelism, I won't go into that. That's a tangent. Anyway, so I think that would be my answer, is that, does someone think that drinking the silver solution is going to cure them? I'm sure, because he apparently sold quite a lot to get sued by the state. Did it heal them? Maybe so. I wasn't there. I don't know. But I do think the discussion needs to occur about what is actually being spoken in those contexts, and to sit with it a little bit, and to sit with the people who believe that it is healing them and affecting them. So that would be my answer with it.
Maybe just a quick response would be an example on social media of listening to multiple voices about how COVID is affecting people. there's a big dilemma across the country with reservations creating checkpoints for people to go through. And our governor here in South Dakota has called in the federal courts to try to stop that. What's interesting for me is if theological reflection begins with those who need the checkpoints, it's different than the perspective of trying to stop the checkpoints. So part of that listening for me is just being on lots of social media platforms, which let me hear that other voice. And so I think one of the things of staying with the trouble is that theological reflection has to begin with multiple voices intersecting where the trouble is actually occurring in profound ways, and allowing people to find their own vulnerability. I think one reason when we get fearful is we tend then to protect ourselves. And it's very difficult to cross that boundary into listening to others.
Yeah, I would only add just quickly is there. I mean, I think this piggybacks on both of you are saying, in the sense that we have to respect that someone else's good life is good to them, and it may not be good to us, but it is good to them. And so there has to be some curiosity on why is that good? Why is it good to drink the silver potion? But it is good to them. And I think we live in a very dismissive culture too, where it's just like, you're an idiot and these people are stupid. And I think there needs to be a little bit of the Christian virtue of humility and some mercy, at least to be interested. And I think the second level of that is, as a human being, we need some kind of sense of recognition. We need people to recognize us. And I actually think you have a lot of leeway to push back against people when they feel like you've recognized them enough. Like you've recognized that that this for them means the good life. And so now that you recognize that, you can also say that your sense of the good life is very different than that. And this is why. And so there can be a moment of dialogical conversation about that. But I think we are, again, I'll beat the same drum. I think we're going so fast that we don't have time to actually listen to someone else. We have already decided they're stupid. There's nothing good in the life that they're trying to live. So there's no even curiosity to hear it.
I wonder if there's a sense that that in context where you're a congregational leader or a community leader of sorts across large amounts of difference, a lot of times the criticisms about ideas are not actually about the idea anyway. They're a type of like they're identified as the problem, but the real problem isn't the substance, it's the actual relational dynamic. And our current context is the crises upon crises has raised the cultural anxiety to the point that then when there's these battles and debates about who owns culture or who owns what's normative or who defines the good life or all these, who's a real American or all those type of things, lead to this anxiety about your own identity. And when you want to be affirmed by someone, say your child who's now an adult who's posting things on Facebook that you think is basically calling you a racist, then you complain to them about something or whatever, but you really are asking, like, do I still matter to you? And criticism is so often really a form of pursuit, that you criticize someone because you really want to know if there's some type of affirmation there. And anxiety in cultures and in family systems, congregational systems, is tied to that type of anxiety. I think one of the beautiful parts of the gospel is that the most true thing about you is you're God's beloved. And that's actually true even about my enemy, which means to show up at any relationship, there's a dignity given to them that's given to me that's deeper than anything we perform and call our identities that you have to attend to. Now, I'm not saying I'm good at it. I'm just saying that so often when you're called to account or called into things, this happened so much when I was a minister, and that a criticism is a form of pursuit. And in anxious situations, be it a church is wondering if we're going to go forward or COVID, and then you have the rise of a growing awareness of the history of white supremacy and the church complicity in it, that churches where your white neighbors are with the most white group they're going to be with all week, they might get anxious and decide to care about the atonement theory you just said. So the criticism is a form of pursuit is extremely helpful. And then I think, and this is one of the questions that got sent in, was how, when you think practically about theology, do you incorporate the social science of thinking through changing someone's mind, or communicating across difference, or holding a shared identity? Because sometimes the simple act of going, that's wrong, isn't a long-term play to communal transformation, even if it's prophetically clear. So how, as practical theologians, do you negotiate that tension of the prophet priest dialectic, or do you think about it relationally? How do you negotiate the improvisational act of moving between those two spaces?
A practice that I learned from physicians is coming from a woman named Jenny Bolton, who's written a lot on what she calls point of view writing. It sounds really simple, but I do it with my students, where I ask them to imagine or think back on a situation where they were really irritated at somebody. Maybe, and I gave the example of standing waiting to pay for my groceries while the woman in front of me, who's 40 years older, is still writing her check out, right? And I'm ready to get on and get home. And then what you do is ask them to write for 5 or 10 minutes from the person's perspective that you're irritated with. Now, at one level, in the case of physicians, this is so if they have a patient that they don't like, which happens. And so they try to get inside that person's head. And then I had students read those aloud that wanted to. And we all talked about how transformative that is. It's a very simple practice, but at least momentarily you try to figure out why on earth somebody is in that. And then it gives you reflection on yourself. I wonder, how that kind of literally practice of doing that, and it's not perfect, but it begins to help.
Yeah, I mean, when I first gave this presentation, I did it at the Edinburgh Research Seminar, and I remember someone said, "So are you saying that you're a Marxist?" And I was like, I don't think so. I'm not sure that's what I was saying, but I think it's exactly what you said, Trev, which is that I think people feel really protective of their space. And actually, we're not taught to communicate in ways. I mean, we were taught at a very early age a 3-point thesis, right? Or whatever, 4-point thesis. And we were trying to prove something, like if you ask me about, Georgia football, and you say you're a Tennessee fan, I'm going to say, ew, go, like I'm going to become a 10-year-old basically and throw my stuff out of the pram. It's not how we're taught now you give me theology and I'm like, well, let me tell you, and it's like, so I don't think it's how we're really wired to communicate when it comes to stuff like this. Like if I scroll through Twitter, I'm the worst Twitterer in the whole world. Because I get on there for 5 seconds and I'm just like, ugh, like, oh gosh, they said that, that sort of thing. I think, and I want to say something, but then I don't, because I don't want to get on this long thing and where someone says something and then someone says something else and it goes on and on and on. And it's like, I think that's just how we're wired to, we're wired to be right. And we're actually not wired to, as you said, Andy, we're wired to the next thing. We're wired to win, and winning is getting to that next thing. We're not wired to sit with sort of the ugliness of ourselves and what we're seeing in someone else. Because it's
Leah.
Yeah.
So my favorite line in your talk was, "It's okay to be wrong, but being late is costly." And one of the comments has come in, and now I haven't read the Harper's letter on cancel culture, so I've no thoughts on it apart from it was Harper's Magazine. But the question was really like, when you're thinking about theology and drawing the boundaries, and when you speak and don't speak, and when you make space and you don't make space, how do we cultivate making space, right, for someone we see holding bad theology, making progress and change, and that actually ends up enabling harm to others, right? And I have had moments as a minister where you're sitting there knowing that like either way you lean, you're either going to be closing someone else off for change, or like telling someone, I know this was unjust and wrong and harmful, but like, could you be patient with the bigot for a minute? And so like that's why I'm a philosophical theologian. We will just use words in other languages and defer having a clear opinion. And then we'll just do this. Yeah. But is there any advice on how you negotiate those spaces? Because so often there are, ethical reasons pulling you in both directions, where you feel that dissonance that Anne was talking about very strong.
Yeah, this is something I think most of us wrestle with to some degree or another. I find this to be an extremely psychologically difficult few years, right? Like it's like I have warring impulses, where one is sort of like relational preservation, enabling enabling good relationships and kindness and love to flourish with the people that I interact with, but at the same time wanting to call out like what I consider to be outright evil and harm and dangerous kind of talk and theology and sort of arguments that are actually leading people into very difficult and unnecessarily difficult and painful situations. And so it's like I have, I think probably a lot of us have like these dueling kind of impulses. So like relational preservation and kindness and charity, but also like needing to create change and needing to say difficult things and trying to find a way to bring these two together. I mean, probably many of us have family members where this like in some way it can be the most frustrating experience, but also the most rewarding, because you have a context of love that is sort of binding you together, and you have moments of tenderness and vulnerability that are like acting as padding to the more difficult parts, right? So you have moments and interactions with them that allow you to see them for the fullness of who they are and why they think the way that they think and why they feel the way that they feel. And so in those sorts of relationships, you can kind of hold their awful views, their awful theology, and start conversations in a more loving way than with people who might not be more, where you don't have that direct context in some ways. But that, I mean, that's pretty limited. That's a pretty limited context. That's like 4 or 5 people for me, So it's not, I don't think I have a clear, this is something I really do struggle with, like on the psychological level. Like we're not like evolved to operate in this sort of context. And especially when we have like these warring good impulses that are both theologically like grounded, right? So I have no answers, but I share the frustration.
Yeah, no, I mean, I think luckily for you, Trump, all theology is practical. So your philosophical stuff's just been abstracted. So that's okay. It's a safe space, I hear. I wouldn't know. But Browning, reference Browning. But what I will say is I think absolutely, Sarah, I mean, there's a reason why this project sat on a shelf, because there was no way that I was going to come out and start writing about this stuff when I first turned in my PhD. And I think part of it is because it is, I liked your, what did you say, relational preservation. I think that's a really important phrase, actually. I think the sort of idealistic response to that would be that practical theologians, I think, don't have the choice in not speaking about what's happening in the world at the moment, because that's what that's part of what we're supposed to be doing, I would say personally. And so the question then is, how do you go about, sitting with troublesome theology and not calling it out as such? I found that recently, and indeed in writing this book, is that I do call it out now. But what I try to do in calling it out is to say, let's have a discussion. So you disagree with me fundamentally, and that's absolutely okay. So then write your own book and we'll talk about it. Like the talking about it aspect, it sounds so kind of like basic, but it's something I think that we've forgotten how to do. And it's why with research seminars, it was always difficult, because it's like you present something and then a bunch of people will raise their hand and say what they think about it, and it's not a conversation. And so I think now if I see it, say I'm holding myself to my own standard and saying I'm completely biased. I've constructed my own theology. I think my theology is good because I've constructed it. I think yours is bad. Here is why, with the criteria. Let's have a discussion about it. Let's talk about it. And so it's trying to, in some ways, move the way theology, I mean, this sounds big-headed, but practical theologians have been trying to move the way theology is done for a really long time. And I think this is what we're trying to move it towards, is a more dialogical view. Now, if something is harming, as you said, Trep, or overly, oppressive in this moment, you better believe that I'm going to say something about it, but with all of that bias in mind as well. I don't think we have a choice as practical theologians. I just don't. Not anymore. We've again, limiting language. We've screwed up theology for too long now to not say anything.
I'll just say it's always frustrating when you were clear on something a year or two in front of your friend and they didn't lose their job and you did. I'll just like that experience has happened to me and other friends of mine. And I think that's the predicament that you have to recognize as like someone of privilege. Like that's one of the things you have to figure out. And I remember a couple of years ago, I did a movie called The Road to Edmond. It's like a buddy road trip comedy on LGBTQ stuff and inclusion and things. And like the decision to make the movie was a big deal. Like I'd been advocating kind of like open and affirming stances in congregations ever since like Alicia and I found out we were having a kid. We weren't going to go to a church where you debated welcoming people, whether or not economic justice was an issue, and having a planet our grandkids can breathe on. So we changed where we worked because we weren't going to be like the edgy minister in a congregation, right? But there is a very different logic on the I had versus in the congregation and with people I hung out with than what I did publicly in a public space. Because of the podcast, I try to have people from all over the church on. And if you listen, you know what I think. It's just like if I'm aggressive in certain places, I lose the ability to have the interviews that then bring other people into the web connections. And it got to a point where I was mentoring or facilitating these 3 megachurch preachers in Southern California who were like deciding they wanted to be open and affirming, but weren't sure how to do it. And they're like freaking out, and then one of them had a student commit suicide in their congregation. And that individual preacher had come to a much more open space for 6 years and had thought he was strategically leading them to be open. And he had not talked about it except as examples of same-sex relations doing beautiful things like adopting children or whatever for that whole period, and was trying to grow it. And then a kid just assumed in the silence of white American evangelicalism judgment. And so that was kind of a moment where I realized that like the way you negotiate yourself if you are a leader in the church, like it's not what you say or what you do that completely defines things. It's also like the inertia of the stream you're in, right? Like if your tribe is running in circles around a kiddie pool and then you're just walking a little slower, trying to talk them into running the other way, you're still moving the same direction they are, and it gets picked up. And that's the, like when you talk about the harm thing, why I think it's really important that the context for lots of ministers that are thinking it is the ground, their congregation, their friends, people they touch. But there's this whole cultural energy that is also feeding into the spaces where they're silent or vague that is informing congregants. And when that group of ministers wrestled with that minister's like grief around losing someone, it was really a game changer. And I just realized what stands in the silence in the body of Christ is often something that puts people on crosses, and that's just not acceptable. And the idea of my kids thinking I thought that was reasonable is so problematic, but I also don't know. I don't like feel like I don't want to prescribe that to other people. I just think it's such a really difficult situation. Anyway, sorry, Anne wants to say something.
Well, as you were talking, I just thought about with all of us, especially in my setting's more academia than the parish, but I still teach 18 to 22-year-olds, and it has that sort of fluidity. But as a tenured full professor, I think I have responsibilities that somebody who is not tenured has. And so I try to think about those experiences of constructing classrooms where and we talk about what those boundaries are. There are certain things that you can't tolerate, right? Because it creates an unsafe space for learning, for expressing ideas. That's why sometimes philosophy or other narratives are helpful, is to get at somewhat of a critical distance as well. I think Andy has written a book on Bonhoeffer. I use Bonhoeffer's story all the time with my students because it gets us into this discussion of what do you do with he struggles with what to do with his enemy. And it's such a frank discussion, but we're also able to look at that both from within and from without. And I think with tenure and promotion comes great responsibility. And I don't know how I would feel about ordination. I think it's a little bit different situation there. But I think they both hold positions of some privilege that bear deep responsibility.
Yeah. Thank you. That's great. I'm aware of the time. We are just about up. Thank you all so much for your contributions. This is a great chat and we can continue going for hours. I think, why don't we close with a fun question, but maybe a chance to give your shortest vent ever. This came in from one of our audience members. What do each of you wish that people in other disciplines knew about practical theology?
Well, I hinted at this in my paper, but it's practical theology is not just about church studies. And I think there is that connection. Lived theology, that group, I'm going to stay on you. I'm coming at you at AAR every time. It should all be one, in my opinion. So I would emphasize that. There's a highly philosophical and highly systematic history that comes with practical theology. As a discipline, we do know theology. We don't talk about Barth all the time. Sorry, but we know him. We know him. And what's the last thing? Oh, and all theology is practical, but I've already said that. So, and it's the best. So that's fine.
Oh boy. I think I would first of all say that there is legitimate criticism towards practical theology when we get stuck in the weeds over methodology. And I think this is probably true in every field, is that, yeah, and just kind of justifying ourselves. But maybe that's the pet peeve too, is why there needs to be justification and of the field itself. But that in many ways, if we do think that in some ways revelation is a concrete thing, like God does encounter people, then you can't really avoid it. So you have to make sense of it. So yeah, I guess the same thing that Leah said, that it gets devolved into kind of pragmatic tasks and things like that, when I think there's a pretty significant direct conversation that's theological and yeah, and lived.
I've always identified myself, ironically, as a systematic theologian or a philosophical theologian with a practical edge. But I think for me, the word is embodiment. I don't, theology doesn't happen abstractly. It's always done by people with legs, if you want to use Leah's metaphor. Yeah. So.
Awesome. Well, thank you all for hanging out on the internet and joining. Definitely, if anyone missed their keynote addresses, you can go check it out. Also, next week, there's going to be 2 live sessions. On Monday is the theological ethics session with Adam Clark and Gary Dorian, which is going to be fun. On Wednesday, the Live Theology section with Daniel White Hodges and Brian McLaren, which is a variation of practical theology. Footnote, Leah Robinson. But you can join those. Go check out their keynotes at theologycon.com. And with that, we'll say, good night from where it's 9:30, and good afternoon to those of you in the States.
Thank you all for being here.